Okay. Just so you know, if you love this program or any of our previous breakfast programs, they are recorded, put on the DORR YouTube channel. So you can watch all of our wonderful programs, and there's a lot of really good ones. I'm Ellen Ferreira. I am the president of Democrats of the Red Rocks. We do these, thank you. We do these breakfasts once a month, the third Friday of every month here at 9:30. Next month, we are going to have the 3 candidates for the Corporation Commission. Anybody who doesn't know what the Corporation Commission is or why it is so important, please come next month and you'll learn a lot. All these candidates have their different perspectives and they're just terrific. Our speaker today is John Washington, and I'm going to let our programs chair introduce John. Let me just tell you that John has to leave us in around 10:45. So we will make announcements about things to come and things that are important after he has finished his presentation. So this should be great. I'm looking forward to it. It's great to see everybody here. Thank you for coming. Here is George Lee to introduce our speaker.
John Washington is basically a journalist and an author. His latest book, The Case for Open Borders, was just published in February. And he's written other books on the border. He's a journalist with Arizona Luminaria, does a lot of work in border issues, also criminal justice. It is a real pleasure to have him, to be able to take time in his schedule to be with us. And, he will be receptive to all kinds of questions that you may have about the border. He's looking for a format of back and forth discussion after his introductory remarks. It is with great pleasure that I introduce John to you.
Thanks so much, George. And hi to everyone who's attending. Can folks hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and the current situation along the border and what my reporting has been covering in recent months and years. And then I'm very excited to have a discussion with you all and answer questions, and we can get into any aspect of it that y'all feel is important to talk about. So I'll begin by explaining a little bit about how I came to this most recent book, which is The Case for Open Borders. And I'd say there's sort of 2 different pieces that drove me to want to write it. The first was spending time along the border. So I grew up myself. My mother is Romanian, and she crossed many borders to make it to the United States. And I grew up hearing stories about immigration and escape from countries and people hiding in train compartments and swimming across rivers and things like this. I grew up in sort of exurban Ohio, and thought all those stories were from some long ago past. And I was, pretty sheltered as a lot of young kids are, and just thought that these were stories told from like the black and white days, and didn't understand that this was something that was happening currently in the country that I was, being raised in. And so when I sort of came of political age and I started realizing that those stories are still happening, and in some ways are happening even more than in recent past, I was a little bit shocked. And I was shocked not only that they were happening, but shocked at how they could be hidden from view. I was kind of far away from the border at that point, but I think that sort of mindset applies less so now, but I think it's still, there seems to be a remove from a lot of people's day-to-day life and the actual conditions on the border. And that remove, I think, takes 2 forms now. One is, sort of like some degree of out of sight, out of mind. And the other is we talk about what's happening along the border in really abstract terms. We think about how many people are coming, about what policies we have, what policies we may want. And we often forget that, not only do those policies have direct impacts on human beings, but that there are human beings currently, right now, who are suffering because of those policies. And I think that it's a problem, and it's a shame that we're able to talk so glibly about immigration politics, that politicians are able to use it as a talking point or as, a campaign tactic. And I think really do forget about the current reality and the real day-to-day situation along the border. And one of the things I want to do is talk to you about what the border is currently like. But I'm going to first start by sort of explaining the motivations of the book. And so one of the reasons I want to write the book is to sort of bridge that gap between the way that we talk about it or don't talk about it and what is actually happening along the border. And I think that gap, as I said, it's somewhat shrunk a little bit because the border is such a big talking point now. But I think in another way, the gap has actually grown, and that's because there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding about what's happening along the border that we can rattle off a few supposed facts or rattle off our viewpoint about what's going on along the border, and that doesn't actually match reality in a lot of situations. So another big reason I wanted to write this book is that I think that coming from the left, as I do, I was, and also coming as a reporter, I was able to have a lot of discussions about people who are really upset about some policies, especially during the Trump administration, but certainly before as well, during the Obama administration, who began detaining families, who at that point had deported more people than any other president in the country. And a lot of people were like, I don't agree with that. I don't think families should be detained, or I don't think we should be deporting so many people during the Obama administration. During the Trump administration, they said, there's a lot to complain about. Family separation, the Muslim ban, all of these really just egregiously inhumane policies that Trump and his acolytes, Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, were sort of just throwing everything they could at the wall to try to keep more people out. And a lot of people, in my view, rightfully, were saying that that is inhumane. We should not treat people that way. And they could decry the worst of those tactics. But I think one thing was missing from those laments, from those complaints, and that was what we should be doing. And I think from the left, from the Democratic Party, that positive vision hasn't been articulated. Okay, we don't want to detain as many people as Trump detained. We don't want to deport as many people as some past administrations have deported. But what do we want? And I didn't know the answer to that, and I couldn't find the answer to that really. So I thought, the right in some regard has their ideal vision very well defined. They want to stop people from crossing the border. Currently, Speaker Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, in sort of a lot of back and forth, and the politics and the discussion got kind of complicated and nuanced, but there's a recently proposed Senate bill that dropped in February, and it garnered bipartisan support and then was basically became dead in the water the day that it was introduced because Trump didn't like it, whatever. The Speaker of the House said, we actually want to stop all people who are trying to file asylum claims from crossing the border. So they have a zero vision of what they want to happen along the border. They don't want anyone who doesn't have prior authorization to cross. Okay, again, but then what is the left want? What is their goal for how the border should be managed? And I still don't really hear a clear idea of what that's like. So we can paint one extreme very clearly, nobody crosses. But what is the other extreme? Well, open borders, what does that mean, really? What would that look like? And what would it herald? Like, well, what would happen if we open the borders? And so in many senses, the book that I wrote is an exercise in ideas of like what that would be like, but also another big part of it is showing the actual impacts of the border. So I'll talk about those two things now. First, I'll start with what actually happens along the border, and the second, I'll try to talk a bit about what would an open borders world look like, or what should it look like. That is of course, looking into the future is always hard, but we have some models that we have been able to look at in the past, and we have some ideas for how we would like it to look. And there's been a lot of theorists who are sort of, maybe in either ivory towers or relegated to the margins that you don't really hear about, but there have been people doing some of that good work. So first is what's going along, what's happening along the border right now. And one of the things that I noticed too, I've been covering border and immigration politics for a long time, is that people are able to cross. And even if they get picked up, detained, deported, a lot of people pick back up and try again. We saw this most recently and a lot during the implementation of Title 42, which is this public health authority that maybe a lot of you heard about. This was first enacted under the Trump administration at the beginning of the pandemic. And that gave border officials the authority to immediately push back anyone who crossed the border. And they used that millions of times. And their idea was, so they actually started trying to implement this before the pandemic hit, because they, like I said, they were trying to throw everything at the wall to block people from coming as possible. So there was like a brief moment where a bunch of people got infected with measles at a detention center in Arizona. And Stephen Miller, one of Trump's main immigration guys, was like, let's enact Title 42 and stop everyone from coming because it's a public health threat. That didn't work. And then when the pandemic happened, they were chomping at the bit and ready to do it. And so they did. And they implemented this authority, immediately pushed back people. And what happened, interestingly, is that more people were crossing the border. They got pushed back and they turned right back around and they tried it again. So, when you look at that, you say, oh, maybe like a lot of people now want to re-implement some version of Title 42, but it didn't work. And this is sort of the theme that I was starting to notice, and one of the themes I want to talk to you about today. So the big idea is that deterrence doesn't work. Walls don't work. And we have decades upon decades of evidence in the United States and in many other countries showing that they change the way that people migrate. They make migration more deadly, more difficult, and they make people suffer more, but they don't stop people from migrating. So Title 42 is, case example number one. Another big one, which I already mentioned here briefly, is family separation. So probably the most draconian, the most just heartless policy that you could imagine. And they intentionally took children away from their parents, deported the parents without the children, had such a disorganized system of doing so that they lost a lot of the kids, they lost contact with the parents. Even during that, and they got so much media attention. I was reporting on it extensively. I was in El Salvador during much of that period, reporting on people who had been sent back without their children to El Salvador. Even during all of that clamor, all of that just moral outrage, and all of that sort of like advertisement for deterrence. If you cross the border, this is what potentially could happen to you and your children. More families were crossing the border. And that even caught me a little bit by surprise. And I think, again, here's another incredible example of deterrence failing. So what is driving people to migrate, that they're willing to risk losing their children or being separated for extended periods from their children? And that's a whole big question, and I won't get too far into that because there's a long legacy of both U.S. involvement, U.S. meddling in Central America and in many other parts of the world. There's all sorts of reasons countries are being destabilized, climate change, economic insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. We can get into some of that maybe in a moment, but the bigger point is that these deterrence methods don't work. You can zoom out and look at some of the really big picture parts of it as well. Is, for example, the current percentage of the U.S. population who are foreign born is a little under 15%. And that number has held steady for about 100 years. Over that century, we have also implemented so many different attempts to block people from coming. And when you look at the numbers, it's like, well, that didn't work. None of that worked. really, because not only has the percentage held steady, but because of the population has increased so much that that 15% now uh, is represents a many more people, like way more people than I did in 1924. So, that also applies to other countries as well. And one of my favorite examples of deterrence not working, just because it's just so, I don't know, richly ironic, is Brexit. So during the whole run up to the campaign to get Britain out of the EU, a lot of it had to do with migration. Most of it had to do with migration. There was a lot of lies that were, spilled into the newspapers. Boris Johnson, former PM, made a lot of hay out of supposedly immigrants taking welfare benefits, depleting the public health services. When you looked at the numbers, when you really studied hard, it was like, well, that's actually none of that was really true. But they finally got out of the EU. They finally voted to get out of the EU a couple years later after just all sorts of fits and starts that actually pulled out of the EU. And the 2 years immediately subsequent to the Brexit, more people migrated to Britain. So, it doesn't work. Okay. So if the border doesn't do what it's purported to do, what does it do? That's another real question that I think hasn't really been clearly answered. And that's another thing I look at hard in my book. Again, it's a huge, huge question, and there's so many different areas and ways that you can answer it. But I think that there's a couple quick ones I can touch on. One, it is a very successful campaign tactic to talk about the threat of an other, to stoke fear amongst the population and use that to gather their vote, to gain their vote. And that was something that was implemented very successfully by Trump in 2016, 2015 and 2016. And certainly he and others are doing it again. And that's happening not only in the United States, but in many other parts of the world. Germany as well, Italy, the current PM of Italy ran on immigration and won. The rise of the far right in Germany is predicated upon stoking this fear of the other. So it works as an electioneering tactic. It also works to make people money. And so there's a couple different ways that happens. One is that there's what I think is rightly called the border industrial complex. There are many billions of dollars being poured into wall construction, surveillance technology, immigration detention. I mean, all those are booming industries right now, and a lot of people are making pretty pennies off of it. The other is a little bit more complicated, and it's a really important way to understand what the border actually does do, is corporations have been able to use the border as what I call something like a fiscal fulcrum. They've been able to use the differentials in wages, in labor rights, in worker protections of all sorts, like safety protections on different sides of the border, to offshore or nearshore production of many different things. And that has been hugely successful for corporations. What has happened is the place that I grew up, rural and urban Ohio, has been gutted of its industrial jobs. I have a lot of family members who used to work in steel, in auto manufacturing. Those jobs are no longer there. And where are they? Well, a bunch of them are in Mexico. You go across the border into Mexico, and there's these maquiladoras, or basically modern day sweatshops, where people are paid a small percentage of what they would be paid in the Midwest or elsewhere, except that they're in Mexico. And so that is great for business for the corporations. They are one of the foremost lobbyists for making sure that these sort of border restrictions and immigration restrictions remain in place. So, race is a whole other huge topic that can't be ignored, and I think is something we could get into as well. But I just kind of want to paint out a couple examples of what the border does not do, keep people out very effectively, and what the border does do is it makes people pretty good money. So the other sort of big part and the second part of this intro is, what would an open borders world look like? Well, it's in some ways, it's hard to answer, and in other ways, it's easy to answer. We have some models we can look at right now. I think the United States of America is the easiest go-to. We have a collection of 50 states that have very different cultures. Depending, maybe there's not a huge culture difference between Arizona and New Mexico. Maybe there kind of is there, but there's some like where like the distinctions are a little bit less clear, but there are certainly distinctions. I mean, you go from Texas to Maine and very different places. They have different laws, they have different tax schemes, they have different cuisines, they have different histories, etc. And people are able to cross those borders completely freely. They have to, if they're going to resettle in one of those new states, they have to register at the DMV, they have to register to vote, they have to register to pay taxes and all these different things. And it's a headache, and you have to get through the bureaucratic red tape. But the presumption is that you can do it, and it works. And we have incorporated over the country's history many more states. We've kept on growing, up until relatively recently. So I think the United States itself stands as an example. The other obvious one is the EU. There was a lot, and this is obviously also a much more recent example. There was a lot of concern, especially among the right, that all of these people from Eastern or Southern Europe were going to go to Western or Northern Europe and fill up all the jobs. They were going to change the culture. There's going to be these like swarthy hordes that were going to be coming in, and they were scared of, like, my cousins. I have plenty of cousins still in Romania who are going to go to France and Spain and take all their jobs, and that didn't happen. Not only did that not happen, but both economies, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, actually benefited from the openness. And one other of the main fears was the cultural fear that these Western European countries were going to lose their cultural identity. Those fears also weren't realized. France is still very much French. The French language is still very much alive and stoutly defended. Same with Spain, same with many other countries who were, joined the EU. So there are these two obvious examples, and it seems like, well, we have these sort of large, almost like regional sized examples of open borders policies. But of course, around the edges of them, around the edges of the United States, we see that there are very fiercely and militarized, or fiercely drawn and militarized borders, and same around EU, increasingly so with the idea of fortress Europe. But I think that in many regards, we have sort of proof of concept that it has worked. And you can also go back into history as well. So there hasn't exactly been a period of global open borders, but from the shift from empire to the rise of nation states, which was a few centuries long process, we really didn't have anything at all like the closed border system that we have today. You just go back into the United States history, and you see that, well, for the first 100 years of this country's history, there was 0 federal immigration statutes on the books, 0. Of course, I think that example kind of can be cut both ways. One is, yeah, okay, we had a system of basically open migration, both to the eastern seaboard and then across, going west into like wherever at the moment was defined the western edge of the United States. But also, it wasn't like it was some heyday. And there was a lot of other problems, and I think those problems were kind of wrapped up in what could be understood as sort of like proto-bordering. So this like sort of initial ideas being implemented and processed that were the beginnings of what we see as our bordering infrastructure today. And those were forced displacement of indigenous people. This was in some regards like the very beginning of what our deportation system could be like, and also the forced movement of enslaved people from Africa, and then also the Fugitive Slave Acts were, in some ways look like a very early version of deportation policies, or just the policing of movement as well. But around the edges of the country, we did not have these borders. And then, throughout the 20th century too, the way that people crossed, especially the US-Mexico border, was very, very different than it is today. For folks older than me in the room, you probably remember some of this, but you could cross the US-Mexico border with relative ease, sort of depending who you were and what papers you had, of course, but even folks who did not have papers could do so much more easily than they could now. And until the 1990s, we really had very, very little actual wall or fence infrastructure along the US-Mexico border. Until the 1990s, that was not that long ago. And yet we hear these people say today, like, oh, a nation that doesn't defend its walls isn't a nation at all. A nation without borders isn't a nation. But then, I mean, were we not a nation in the 1980s? Were we not a nation in the 19th century? I think that we would very much say that we were. ICE is another example. ICE hasn't been around for very long. ICE was actually formed in 2003. So it's only 21 years old. And we've survived as a country for 95% of our entire history without ICE. I think the argument for open borders is saying like we could probably survive again. One other huge piece of this, and I'll end shortly, is so like what would it look like? We have to work to get there because we've actually never quite seen it. But a lot of people really do think it's possible. One is, and there's a couple reasons. The main fears, I think, about possibly what would happen with open borders, the main fears are that the country would be overrun. The other one is that our economy would tank. And looking really hard at those two ideas, I think that those fears are way overblown. One is, our country, like if we open borders tomorrow, probably a lot of people would come. I'll cop to that, and I think a lot of theorists who are proposing open borders would as well. But already a lot of people come, and already a lot of people are sort of figure out a way with some help, some of them, and on their own, others, to sort of weave themselves into the social fabric, to assimilate, to find a place. We have, for how large our country is, we have a relatively, actually, a very small, or like a very, we don't have a very dense population compared to how big we are compared to a lot of other countries. So we could probably absorb a lot more people, but also so a lot of folks are coming because they have to, but a lot of people also want to stay at home. There's some interesting facts here. One thing that, especially for the immigration restrictions in Europe, that is, I think, surprising, a lot of people forget, is that 90% of all African refugees right now live in Africa. That means they crossed a border, they left their home countries, but they went to a neighboring country. And that is typically how immigration works. So if you look at the total number of international migrants in the world, overwhelmingly, they're in neighboring or near neighboring countries. For an example, closer to home, Venezuela. There's been a lot of talk about Venezuelans coming to the United States and how to receive them or expel them and block them. But overwhelmingly, Venezuelans have been going to Colombia and Peru, these countries in Central America or South America. People don't really want to leave if they don't have to. So the one huge corollary to the idea of opening borders is not only fighting for the freedom of movement, but also fighting for the freedom to remain, fighting for the right to remain at home. And that involves a whole bunch of other issues. As I said, it's like a really complicated topic, but I think it's an important one. And the last point I'll touch on here is the other fear, which is that the economy would tank. And this is, I think, in many ways, the easiest one to dispel because I have all economists on my side. You look at any economist worth their fiscal salt, and any way they've studied the issue, they recognize that immigration is a net positive for local, regional, and national economies. You look at wages. Actually, wages are not affected nearly as much as people think. They typically stay about neutral, and if there's any effect, they usually go up. So overall numbers of contributions into tax pools and how much money is being used because of schooling, because of hospital visits, because of potential welfare benefits. In the first generation, that number typically breaks even, but in some regards, that number actually is in that positive. When you look into the second and third generation of immigrant families, the number is hugely in the black. People contribute, newcomers contribute to economies in so many different ways. And, you look at these studies here in the United States, you look at studies in Europe and Asia and Africa, and migration is always a positive for the economy. Some people overall, when you think about an economy, you're looking big picture. Some people, probably, there'll be some, negative effects, but those negative effects can be addressed. I mean, anytime there's a major change to any sort of system, there's some people, there's going to be, there's going to be a couple of winners and losers, of course. Overall, there's going to be mostly winners. Some people who are potentially let me give you an example, because I'm talking a little bit in abstract, but so even in periods of very high immigration over a short period of time, it's a net positive for local economies. But there are some small segments of the economy, and there's a study done in the 1980s when a lot of Cubans were coming to Miami, showing that it was actually pretty good for Miami. It was pretty good for Florida overall. It was pretty good for the country. About 160,000 people came from Cuba to Miami in like a few months, which was a huge, very quick increase. But there's like a couple of accounts that are like, well, if you count second generation high school dropout Cuban immigrants working construction, their wages went down for the first 2 years. It's like, okay, yeah, that is true. You really boil it down. That's also a sliver of their overall economy. And because of all the benefits accrued in all other, portions of the economy, could we not have also done something to address that small segment and recognize that there's going to be some possible negative impact somewhere and try to buoy those people up? And so it seems like it is doable. So overall, the big picture is we have this idea of something that could potentially work, and we have a lot of evidence showing that actually it wouldn't have the negative effects a lot of people fear. It's also, I think, important to talk about political feasibility. We're not there, obviously. Open borders isn't on the table, especially in 2024, when both right and left have been pushing hard for more restrictions, for more border enforcement, etc. But one of the reasons, again, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is that I think it's important to understand what this side of the conversation looks like. We have the opposite extreme, but what does the open borders extreme actually look like? And I hesitate to even call it extreme, because I don't think it would be. I think that it's not an extremist attitude to say that somebody who is seeking opportunity or safety or security for themselves and their family should be able to find it. And I don't think that's an extremist point, and I think that we can actually do it. So that is basically the overview of the book. There's a lot more I can get into, and I would be happy to talk about more current conditions on the ground right now, what is going on in Washington with a lot of the policies, but maybe open it up for some questions, if that makes sense, George and other folks moderating this.
It's fine.
It's very good.
Call on people.
Great.
All right.
Let's do it.
So John, I have two questions for you. I want to get them both in now because I may not get a chance again. The first one is, look, we all know that political reality is that branding and messaging are really huge in any of these issues. During the pandemic, when Black Lives Matter happened, there was a huge controversy about the left pushing defund the police. When you use the phrase open borders, people's minds immediately go to, there's not going to be any restriction, anything. How does the asylum system work? You get a lot of negative pushback, even by some parts of the Democratic side. So how do you address that? And my second question is, what's your reading of the policy that the Senate is trying to get passed, like the specifics of it?
Yeah. Two really good questions. I'll start with the second. The Senate bill. And there's been a couple different bills proposed. The one that was introduced in February was immediately shot down, as already mentioned. It was a bipartisan, or I think rather tripartisan. Kristen Sinema was, the independent who was Arizona's representative working on it. It's a Senate bill, and had Republican from Oklahoma, had Democrat from New Jersey, and Sinema, and they knocked their heads together and they came up with this bill. A little bit of context here. So we haven't had a comprehensive immigration bill passed in Congress since 1990. That's 34 years ago. A lot has happened since then. We didn't have the internet as we know it today at all. We didn't have mobile technology. The number of people who were crossing the border, or the people who were crossing the US-Mexico border, were by far predominantly single Mexican men. Some Central Americans leaving the dirty wars there, but a lot has changed in technology, which has changed the way that people move around the globe, which has changed the way that people know about how to move around the globe. The demographic makeup has changed enormously. Starting in about 10 years ago, we got more and more families coming to the border. Now we have people from all over the world coming to the border, people from Africa, people from Asia, people from Europe coming to the US-Mexico border. A lot has changed, and the bills and the policies that we have on the books are old and outdated, and we absolutely need to update them. What my read of what the Senate bill that was proposed recently is that it's actually not, but both sides have come to the agreement that we should further restrict human mobility. There was a lot in the bill that was going to send more money to the Border Patrol, send more money to ICE, send more money to immigration detention, that was going to actually raise the threshold for people seeking asylum. It was going to make it a lot harder for people to move, and it's going to give a lot more money to people who are trying to police them or keep them out or arrest them and detain them. Like I've said, that doesn't really work. You can spend a lot of money doing that, and you're going to make people's lives more miserable. You're going to make people suffer more. You're going to make people die more. We see a direct causation between more border militarization and more border deaths. That was what we had, all three sides of the aisle had shaken hands on and agreed that that's what they wanted to do, including raise the asylum threshold, which is, the asylum protocols were instituted officially after World War II in response to the absolutely abject response of welcoming people fleeing the Holocaust. We're going to make that harder, like access to asylum even harder. President Biden, despite his early months in office, promising to restore asylum, promising to be more humane and not taking a police first approach, was championing the bill. He maybe stumbled or whatever, but he dropped the word illegal a bunch of times, painting people as, like defining people by an act that they commit rather than who they are. He was condemning a person who was, allegedly charged with committing a heinous act. We don't know what happened yet. We have to see. This is about the murder of a young woman in Georgia. He condemned a person before trial to calling them guilty. Just an absolutely rabid response towards migration. I think it's really important to understand that the federal government and say Texas are not on opposite sides of this issue. They're fighting in courts a lot. There's been a number of Texan provisions trying to build private walls, trying to build state walls, trying to police people crossing the border in Texas, and the federal government, the Biden administration say no, we got to take them to court. But they're not on two sides of the issue. They're both fighting for control of who can keep people out. I think it's a really important distinction to make. And you can look historically at this, which as an author, this is what I do is, where did the authorization to control immigration at the federal level come from? It came from the Chinese Exclusion Acts back in the late 19th century. So the monopoly of the federal government that the monopoly that the federal government has in border enforcement came from explicitly racist policies that were defended by the Supreme Court. That is what the federal government today in their filings are relying on to beat Texas and say, no, you guys can't enforce the border, we get to enforce the border. That's not more humane, that's just a different color of cruel. So, I think that the Senate bill, I think it was a good faith effort to address the problem. I think that a lot of people recognize that the system needs to be updated, but what they ended up proposing wasn't going to do it. There was some basically lip service thrown to reducing the backlog of asylum claims. The overall immigration case backlog is over 3 million right now. And the border bill wasn't going to do anything substantively to really address that. We have a more recent example of what ended up being bipartisan approach to bordering, which is the DHS appropriations bill. So this is where they decide how much money they're going to throw at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and especially in terms of immigration enforcement. And same thing, they are sending a lot more money to Border Patrol. They're wanting them to hire 2,000 more agents. They're sending more money to ICE to raise the bed capacity. So that means to put more people in immigration detention centers, to remove more people from the interior of the country, and to spend more money on surveillance technology. All the while, they're reducing, I'm here in Pima County. So Tucson, for a number of months in the past year, was by far the highest sector of where people were crossing over the border. And there was a pretty efficient system to set up to welcome people and orient them for a day or two. All of that was using federal money. And we would basically, give them some food, help them make a phone call, help them find their way to the next destination. Money that was, for federal money that was funding those programs was substantially cut. And that money directly went to border enforcement. So this is where we're at right now with the border. We're tilting further and further and further to the right. I guess on the screen, I have to go this way to make it see. So that was a long answer, and I'll address your other one more quickly because I know there's other questions here. So the other one is about the narrative, about framing, about the politics of framing. You're right. I think we should be strategic about it, but also let's think about the strategy that the Dems have used for well over a decade. I just told you all about what the supposedly agreed upon Democratic proposal was, which was basically tilting further to the right. We tried this tactic under the Obama administration. We tried to pass bipartisan immigration reform in 2013. Same thing. Obama said, I'm going to deport so many people that they're all going to trust me. I'm going to build up all this political capital, and then we'll be able to pass something. Well, that didn't happen. So we failed twice in the past decade. In 2007, the same thing happened. The Democratic strategy at this point is laying down dead and saying like, oh, maybe if the Republicans can run over us with all of their ambitions, maybe then we'll get to come together and pass something. Well, that doesn't seem to be working. So I think I propose, or I'm standing here saying like, maybe we should make an argument on principle rather than try to play politics with this idea. And because we've seen that it's failed. So yeah, you run a risk. I think open borders is a scary thing, but also I think if you believe in it, if you believe in the freedom of movement, if you believe that people should be able to find safety in this world and not be consigned to basically uninhabitable conditions, then I think you should say that. And I think that, doing so, we're not going to get there, but you might start drawing back the conversation more towards the center, more towards the left, more towards freedom and justice. And, I think that as a journalist, as a reporter, as someone who just cares about this, that's my ambition, not to try to play the political calculus and be like, well, we might risk something here. I think it's a worthy concern, but also I think that sort of conceding too much hasn't worked either.
Thank you.
Second. where is the press in offering us some positive stories? I'm from Western New York, and I read about a company there that has hired all immigrants and is amazingly successful, as all immigrants want, not all, but so many want to have a better life. And so they're working in this company with all immigrants. So where is the press offering us and people who are negative these positive stories? And then one other just aspect, where are Lawrence Americans, creative juices, taking people from the border in an ordered way, of course, and educating them? So we know immigrants want jobs, they want better things for their children. So where is the system of educating people, finding what they're good at? We go to shops and they don't have enough staff, always crying about this. There are farms evidently all around the country and California who need workers. So where is the creative aspect of helping people to find a home and a way to work, as America has always done?
Great questions. The first one I get asked a fair amount, and especially my family, because I'm always like, all my articles are like, oh my God, so miserable, this gloom and doom. I mean, not all of them, but reporting and journalism in general is going through a very hard period. We are stretched very thin, and I love reporting those stories sometimes when I can, but we're also drawn to, and I think it's of greater urgency when we see abuses, when we see people marginalized and oppressed and cast into the shadows. We have to run there first, and that is happening to such an incredible degree that we have time for very little else. So when you can catch a breath and you can do one of those other sorts of stories, and we do some of them. So I mentioned, or I think George mentioned at the beginning, I write for Arizona Luminaria. We're a new media outlet in Arizona, a nonprofit. We focus on community journalism. We do some of that. But then all of a sudden, these horrible policies get dropped, or someone, suffers this extraordinary hardship, and we have to prioritize those stories. The second question is also a really good one. That is happening. It is, but I think that there's a block in the politics of it. So there's so many different ways that there's so many different hurdles that people have to jump through once they, cross over to the across the US-Mexico border, enter into the country, before they can start working, before they can get work permits. A lot of it doesn't really make sense when, as you say, there are so many job vacancies. Recent reports showed 500,000+ vacancies in construction industry. Teachers, nurses, all sorts of industries are severely understaffed, and we need people to fill them. We have a far below replacement rate of the US population right now. So if we don't have migrants, more migrants coming, this country is going to be in trouble. And there's been a lot of studies too showing that migrants in recent upsurges, or upticks in migration, have actually kept this economy afloat. Inflation is not as high as it would otherwise be because of migrants. Even people on the right have admitted that. Wall Street Journal did a recent pretty good study on this. And so it is happening, but it does take time. And I think that the shortages and the understaffings are so severe at this point that it's going to take a while, if it ever happens, to really for those positions to really be filled by newcomers. And also, obviously, a lot of people are blocked. There was another recent article in, I can't remember, about a town in Nebraska that relies on meat packing, and specifically Central Americans filling the jobs in the meatpacking industry. And yet they also are like a notoriously anti-immigrant small Nebraska town, but they depend on the migrants. And there's just like this cognitive dissonance there. And I think that's at play on the national scale as well.
Shelley, are there questions from Zoom?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Well, one was a comment just earlier on when you were talking about the different times when people were coming to the US. Peggy Chakins just had a comment on talking about the othering of the Japanese during World War II, targeting a so-called threatening population easily as identified by racial characteristics. That wasn't really a question, but there was a question from Gil Agnew. He said, thank you. I've been very surprised to hear strong speak about Hamas and Hezbollah investing in our borders to infiltrate the US. Wild rumor mongering, I am sure. Are you aware of the source, or is this very widespread diatribe?
Yeah, so the first comment, thanks for that reminder for everyone. Yeah, it is you know, one of the most just awful moments in, you know, immigration history in the United States. The rounding up and internment of tens of thousands of Japanese people, including in Florence. There was and outside of Tucson as well. That was really how the town of Florence became an immigration detention epicenter. So some of the detention centers today are on ground that were used as internment camps for the Japanese. There is a lot of that sort of fear stoking about Hezbollah, about Hamas, about previously, you know, Saudis or Iraqis or whatever, and those fears are not borne out. We have zero incidences in the entire history of the U.S.-Mexico border of someone crossing the border and committing a terrorist act that killed anyone. You know, if you're really worried about terrorism, about dying because of terrorism in the United States, it would make more sense to look within the country, to look at right-wing, alt-right, white supremacist extremists. You know, that's not to say, you know, that it potentially could happen, but, you know, you cannot block the entire border. So people, if they're intent to slip through, will slip through. The real better solution, I think a lot of people argue for, is what's driving the extremists, and to try to address that, because, you know, a 2,000-mile long border, that's just the U.S. Southwest border, cannot be effectively shuttered, and, you know, not all people would be able to be the current way that we have it. Not all people would be able to be screened. Here's another case in point for open borders. The idea of open borders is not that we're just going to open the borders and people can go wherever they want, but we'll have ports of entry where people will actually go, cross, and register. So if the major fear is that we don't know who's crossing the border, which in some regards today we don't. Most people are crossing the border now, turn themselves in willingly to the Border Patrol, but some people still sort of skirt and try to get through the mountains or across the river. But if we were to have open borders and people registered at the ports of entry, we would know exactly who's entering into our country. Because again, the idea would be that they would be able to. We'd be welcoming them, but they would just have to register. So they tell us where they're going. They would start the process of just like signing up for all the different public services and whatnot that they were seeking to get.
Okay, and we've got Barbara had a hand up, and Frankie has a hand up after that. So Barbara.
Yeah, I've been in Arizona for 50 years, my adult life, and I'm visiting in Texas now. And of course, I worked at the Migrant Center in Tucson twice the last year, and it's quite a wonderful thing to be able to do, to welcome people. And yes, you're right. People are coming from all over the world, and they're coming as families and children. And I mean, the news, of course, we all know when we hear the hordes of horrible drug and criminals that are, we know they're not. We know they're not. And I mean, I've got video of friends in Arizona down there of coyotes cutting through the fence with an electric saw, battery operated saw, and letting people through and then putting the fence back, and then Border Patrol going along and mending it. And I mean, this is a continual process. This fence does not hold anyone except maybe large mammals. The difficulty is, and I'm here in San Antonio, and I was at a Democratic meeting the other week, and people spoke about what was happening at the border in Texas, and then the feeling was, well, that's what people in Texas want. They want that razor wire. It's illegal. They're preventing people from even get to the border. So I don't feel the fight here. And I know friends of mine in Arizona, the December before last, were down camping out to stop Ducey's container wall, you know, and that eventually did, and Arizona is paying for it to go on and to go off. It's crazy. There is also an economic value, and I haven't read your book, so I don't know how much you go into this. And Robert Hubble on his Substack wrote about this a week or so ago, an economic value to having migrants. And like I said, I don't know how much detail you go into the math of that, but it's phenomenal. you know, and I think these are the things that we need to talk more about. Obviously, we're not going to talk to certain people about these things because their head is somewhere else in the clouds. But I think we have to get this information out to people. And I thank you for doing what you've done. Yeah, I know it's positive journalism, but darn it, we need some.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Okay, Frankie, I have a bunch more questions in the comments, but I don't know how many you want to do. Go ahead, Frankie.
Okay. Barbara, that wasn't a question. Anyway, I'll jump in for my chance.
Yeah,
I
it
can,
is.
I can sort of
Not,
respond to it after.
Yeah.
Yeah,
after
how
you're-
can John
I'm
continue is
sorry.
probably my question.
Yeah.
He just,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
with people that will listen.
Sorry about that.
So that sort of leads into my comment and question. John, thanks. That's a really great talk. And I'm so pleased that you also remind us of the connection between class and race and global mobility and how that plays out. So we're here with the Democrats of the Red Rock. So what's your thinking about the difficulties that the left has in reframing the narrative? Why? I mean, we have difficulty reframing all narratives, but this one in particular, why is this? Why do we not hear other? I mean, the chat is filled with examples, good examples of the ways that communities have embraced refugees and immigrants. So why can't the party do a better job at talking about this and providing another way of thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have a really clear answer to that. I don't, but I think what's happened, I think we've fallen into the trap of playing politics. And I think that Democrats have sort of relegated the human question to making sure that they stay in office. And has that been a winning strategy? I mean, I don't know, not really. We sort of flip-flop Dem, Republican in the White House, who's controlling Congress, and like it just goes back and forth. So I don't know. It doesn't seem to be that successful so far. There's a lot of other, I think, ways that people theorize or try to understand why immigration has become such an incredibly contentious issue. There's a lot has changed. I mentioned like how much has changed since 1990, since the last time we've had immigration reform. Think just like big picture about the rise of the internet, the rise of globalization over that period. The slow petering loss of a lot of institutions like organized religion or labor, unions. We've really lost a lot of that. So the way that people have identified themselves, the way that people have found community has fizzled, has fallen off in many regards. And so people have looked outward. And the rise of nationalism, I think, is not exclusive to the right. The left too, I think, has sort of leaned on as those other institutions, those other ways of sort of finding identity, community identity, personal identity have fallen off. They have looked to like the nation as a way to find some sort of community or find some sort of home, have some sort of anchor. And I'm not condemning that outright, but I think that it just kind of doesn't make sense as much. Like I talked about the huge differences in different parts of the United States, and yet we try to like artificially forge this idea of a nation state. I think that having a state itself makes all the sense. Like we need a way to organize ourselves politically and in economically. But when we try to think hard about actually how do nation states get formed and how do we decide that these are the people that are going to say that this is the community that we have and those other people aren't. I mean, think about someone in Nogales, Arizona, and their ties to someone in Nogales, Sonora. They are so much more connected and rich, and they have so much more in common than someone from Nogales, Arizona, and someone from, I don't know, Missoula, Montana, or Cleveland, Ohio. And yet we supposedly have this tie between Cleveland and Nogales, Arizona, and this break between Nogales and Nogales. And so I think we too sort of succumb to this idea of like, we need to protect the nation state. And yet, like it is a fiction, it is artificial. And I think that we don't actually lose anything by recognizing that people move back and forth and that we can find identity in a closer knit community. Is a little bit sort of theoretical, my answer there, but it's a hard question to actually ask, is like, why hasn't the left embraced a more positive vision? I think we too are sort of dealing with so much upheaval, global upheaval, so much like identitarian upheaval, that we're just nervous about losing something else, which is this sort of national identity as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat. If we should continue with the chat. I don't know what the room looks like. But Peggy asked a question about the religious groups are being activated for care of the planet. Shouldn't there be a religious force for care of humanity, a fundamental tenet of all religions? Why don't we lean on them? Right. So has the church writ large, what role has the church played?
I mean, it depends on what church you're looking at, really. But churches have played a huge role, and they continue to do so in welcoming migrants and defending, basic human decency along the border and along borders throughout the world. Without the churches in southern Arizona, we would not have had the sanctuary movement, which really grew out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which grew out of the abolition movement in the 19th century. So we have like this through line from slavery abolition through civil rights, through 1980s, 90s sanctuary movement, through some of the people who are doing the most important work along the border today. And yet, of course, there's another number of other groups, religious groups, who are vehemently anti-immigrant. And one of the things I go through in the book is, I have a number of different approaches to explaining open borders. There's the ethical approach, which we haven't really talked about today. There's the economic approach, which I can't remember who asked that, which I get very deep into. And there's a number of other smaller approaches, or, not like trying to devalue them, but just like aren't as commonly talked about, or there's not as much research into. And one is like, all of the world's religions have some tenet of welcoming the stranger. And in fact, that is the basis of a lot of the world's religions. That is like one of the core tenets of their sort of way of understanding how to be in the world. And I think that a lot of religions have since turned their back to that, or are currently turning their back to it. So I do make an appeal, and I look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, and Hinduism as well. And in all of those have examples of different churches or different sects going both directions. But you think if you really boil it down, it's like it is you can't square stopping immigration with believing in one of these major religions.
John, what the script that comes right after, if somebody gets in, what is the path to immigration now? Is it 6 years or citizenship? I mean, what is the path to citizenship currently?
Yeah.
Is there one?
Well, it is a very rocky, windy path. I will say that. So I recently actually did a series. I recommend it. Apologies for recommending my own work, but we did a series at Arizona Luminaria where we sort of tried to answer that question, and it was very hard to do because it really depends on who you are, how you're crossing, and then what luck you have. So currently, I'll try to take you through briefly, if I can, one way, like a common occurrence or path that someone takes. So let's say they're from Southern Mexico or Central America or Venezuelan. They come up through Mexico, they approach the US-Mexico border, they want to ask for asylum, and they ultimately want to find safety and live and have some sort of stability in the United States. To do that, they would eventually need citizenship, because there's a lot of people right now in the United States who have no path to citizenship. And like, think about what that end game is. We're creating a two-tier society. A lot of the people who are crossing now and a lot of people who have crossed before will never be able to gain citizenship status unless we change the laws. So we are actually creating, a system of citizens and a system of people who are not citizens and have less rights. Like haven't we moved beyond that? But so let me go back to this person coming up to the border. Like, what will their the closest they can get to finding full residency status in the United States? They want to ask for asylum. They're told that they need to download an app on their phone. If they don't have a phone, SOL, basically. If they don't speak one of the 3 languages that the app is translated into, that's on the phone, SOL. If they have trouble getting a signal on the app, also. So then they start asking for an appointment to go to a port of entry. Any day, every day at Nogales port of entry, there's 100 people who are given appointments. That's the max capacity. Sometimes it's less than that. And people are left waiting sometimes 6-7 months to gain an appointment. They try every morning when the appointments can open. Or when they can start registering for appointments. They sign up. They get on their phone. They try to sign up. They say no. I talked to people last week who had been doing this for 7 months. It was a family from Guerrero, southern Mexican state. They had taken to living outside of the port of entry on the street because they kept on trying every single day and they couldn't get through. So what are their options? If they don't get through, they can ask for an exception at the port of entry. Those waits for exceptions take about as long, if not more. So that's no pathway through. Or they can submit themselves to human smugglers. So, people who are guides and migrant guides or coyotes. And there's a lot of people who are preying on the folks who are desperate to try to get through. If they submit themselves to the human smugglers, they have to pay a large fee. They get through the border. Someone mentioned like cutting holes in the border fence. That's one way to do it. There's also gaps in the fence. They get through, and typically they'll like present themselves to Border Patrol agents. They might have to walk for a day. They might be out in the cold or, now or very soon in extreme heat, waiting for Border Patrol. People have died doing that. A number of people have died trying to scale and get over the wall because the wall's 30 feet high in many places. If they're able to turn themselves into the Border Patrol, there's a couple different pathways from there it can take. So this is a pathway with lots of forks in it. I'll just go down one of them in a couple more statements to kind of paint it out. Let's say they're paroled into the United States or something. Even that's complicated. So complicated, but they are given basically a permission to be in the United States and given a court date. They'll spend usually a couple days in Border Patrol custody, which is a pretty bad conditions, and they'll be given a court date anywhere from a year to a few years down the road. I think the longest wait for a court to start your asylum claim is about 2027 right now. But there's a rule in place that was put in place by the Biden administration about a year ago that says if you cross the border illegally, so if you go take to the desert and you cross the wall, you do not have access to asylum. You can get a lesser form of relief, but those are technical terms here: withholding of removal or Convention Against Torture. You will not be eligible for asylum, which means you will never be eligible to be a citizen of the United States, which means, again, you're going to have a second tier, or you'll be in what's called twilight status. So you may have a few years where you can be and reside in the United States, and then you'll be subject to deportation. So we're baking precarity and this two-tier system into what is currently going on along the border. Also, one other really important thing to mention, and then I'll stop with this long answer because it is just extraordinarily complicated, but work authorization. You can't get work authorization for before at least 150 days after you officially apply for asylum. Applying for asylum does not mean you show up at the border and ask for it. It's a whole involved process, and your life is at stake here. So you have to get the paperwork, you have to get the evidence, you probably should hire an attorney because you have a much better chance of getting asylum if you have an attorney. All of these things, you have to fill out the form, you have to mail in the form. Only once you do all of that and mail in the form, then you wait 150 days and then you can get work authorization. So it's sometimes years down the road before you can legally work in the United States. So you may be in the United States, you may have a court date years in the future, but you have to wait a year or so before you can even work. And that is our current system right now. And that is just one of the many incredibly arduous ways that people actually are getting in right now. It's an absolute mess, I can tell you that. Yeah, so maybe I do have to get going relatively soon. I have a couple of meetings this morning, but maybe we can do another question or maybe two quick questions.
But John, just trying to follow up on that. If
Yeah.
you could design policies right now, put money into those, what kinds of administrative or helping steps could you put into effect rather than throwing all this money into hardening the border?
Yeah.
This possible?
Great question. I think I have a ton of them, but I can give you two easy ones. Let people work right away. That's what they want to do. We need workers. Just do not put this incredibly nonsensical and, shooting yourselves in the foot, shooting everyone in the foot sort of policy into place where you make them wait 150 days, which really often means a year or more. Give them work permits. And two is do not incentivize people to cross through the deserts and the river. That is why people die. That is why they are kidnapped by human smugglers. You need to put more money into ports of entry, into people who are processing people legally and orderly, rather than making them, because they're so desperate, cross through the desert, and then you're chasing them down or having Border Patrol agents with guns on their hips do these processing of families and babies. I spend time out there fairly frequently, and Border Patrol agents, they hate their job. I mean, they signed up, they thought there was gonna be some cool job running around the mountains or something. They're standing there picking up kids' backpacks and putting them into vans, like worrying about a mom making sure she can corral her kids or whatever. Like that is not safe for anyone. That is not a wise way of spending money. And we can just obviously do it in a much better and much more orderly and much safer way.
I would say at this point then, thank you so much, John. It's been really, really good.
Thank you. Maybe George, feel free to share my contact, or I can put it in the chat here. I'll end on this. One more thing I'd like to say is, again, it's a bit of a self-plug, but I think it's really important to sort of understand what's going on here. And that comes, I mean this in sort of both directions. One is like I try to be down there and understand what's happening along the border and what's happening to migrants a lot. And so, seek out and find folks who are actually on the ground, who are not spewing talking points, but are actually doing the work, and read it. So I hope you support Arizona Luminaria. But second is, and this is an honest plug too for the work you are doing, is we really want to understand what's happening in your communities. We're a new organization, we're a small team, but we're expanding. And so reach out to us with stories. We'd really like to know how you all are experiencing immigration, how you're all experiencing, state politics, and looking forward to or not November of this year. So yeah, I'll drop my my contact in the chat. But thank you for having me, and thank you for the interest. So yeah, see y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Take care.
Both that, we're both not, nobody's gonna be back there.
That was pretty good. Huh? You have to say, George and I put these things together. George found John Washington. And I said, yeah, but who will our second speaker be? George, we need a second speaker. We always have 2 or 3 speakers. And you know what? It's really fortunate we didn't get a second or a third speaker, because this was fascinating. And I mean, we could have probably spoken to him for. I know. Toby is going to take a couple of pictures, because of all the pictures that DORR has, we don't have any of these breakfasts. So if you, all we'll do is put it on the DORR website or Facebook. So if you want your picture, sitting here looking interested, maybe you can just take a couple of pictures to the crowd. That'd be great.
I already got too many.
I think really this is an amazingly interesting topic. I heard some very good things. I mean, one of the takeaways that I loved was from Sandy. We have examples in this community of successfully intaking immigrants and them incorporating themselves and their skills and their families into our communities. I know of several myself. Why are we not publicizing those things like that? Why could the Red Rock News not do a story a week on successful immigration stories?
Good luck with that.
But if we propose something like that, I mean, it seems reasonable. It seems like something that we might. It seems reasonable if we had the staff and the power people to do it and to write it. So I think that's a fabulous suggestion. What did he call it? Freedom of movement as opposed to open borders?
Yes.
I like that a lot better. Like the sound of that a lot better. This is very prickly issue.
Although interestingly enough, my parents were immigrants after World War II, and there were quotas, and it was very difficult for them to come into this country. And they were coming from Switzerland, but they were Jews, and they, it very difficult. So this country always made it that easy for them. They were in New York.
It's a fear. It's a fear of the Lynn?
Really living in Chicago before we moved here, I really saw how immigration really works successfully. I was so impressed with, first of all, you need good public education. My friends were teaching in Chicago public schools where there were 4 and 5 languages being spoken and learning English. That starts with the kids. And so I saw this over and over again as my Polish cleaning lady would come, and as her English got better, cousin would come and she would go on and get an education and do other things. It was fascinating. And I had never seen this before. And immigration was a big part of the city and the city's success. And it was, I thought, wonderful. And I learned a lot about it watching you have to have good public education. That was really critical.
Sandy?
And why after all these years, in the beginning, we were insular. Why all these years being an elementary teacher, that George, as immigrants come in, teaching our children the languages of those people coming in, so that it's respected and it's international and it's what's happening to the world. Who's getting paid that is educating people nowadays? And we claim want an educated population. Teachers are.
No, it's a real shame. Public education is a big deal.
They just, I mean, I think everything you say is nice. I just want, America, there's no housing anywhere for people. You know how many people? I mean, not only from South America and from Central America, you got your Chinese, you got your, you have people from Africa. Conditions aren't getting better in the rest of the world with global warming. I read a big article the other day about how Ecuador was going into, was now destabilized, just like Colombia was, by drug warfare. And the reason you have families is more and more places in the country are going like that. I just want people to think about what open borders might actually mean. Sure, we could accept more people. Sure, immigration is wonderful. I mean, there are real losers to social change. There's winners and losers, and the country as a whole might very well benefit. And so what I think what I'm thinking about is how America, and of course at some point things change and people will stop coming because some circumstances will be that it's not attractive anymore. So I mean, over time, everything works out. And if we're all looking, in the fullness of time, everything works out. Right. There are just, I just wonder how many people really are waiting to come. And I think the country can absorb more people. I think certainly the economy needs more people. And there will be adjustments to everything. But I just want to be provocative.
Well, to say,
And then
trying to keep this short. One of the things that happens when you raise questions about, not enough educational resources, housing resources, health resources, is then you say, some migrants, rather than say, no, the problem is our federalist system, which sucks. all the money out of our economy.
Is that gonna change tomorrow? It's changing now. It's changing even as we speak.
Change, and that's really where the biggest problems is.
Sorry, question.
Come here, man.
I sorry, I came in late. I didn't get a name tag. My name is Linda Bonder. I moved to Sedona in November. And thank you. And I'm an English teacher for immigrants and refugees. I run not an all volunteer nonprofit in Oregon. Has 100 volunteers and 500 adult learners. And the first thing I did to come here, I thought, well, I'm running another organization. Where can I volunteer to teach? The library has no program now. Community college has no program now. I finally found a program that moved from the Methodist church to the Catholic church, and I'll talk to them next week. There's such a need. There are things we can do right here in our community to help our local people who are already here advocate for themselves and their families. And there are people like us in our organization in Oregon. It's people like us. It's not only retired people. There's a lot of folks like us. You can do things to help the folks who are here right now in our community.
I have somebody I'd like to put you in touch with. So yeah, let's talk afterwards. Stephen and then Chris.
Yeah, something that I've been working on, even before I came to Sedona, since before Trump was elected, is that this policy, as well as a number of other litany of other policies, is driven by white supremacy. And the Democrats don't like to talk about it because it's really a hot button kind of topic. But the right looks at the numbers. They understand that this is going to be a minority white population with the next 20 years, and it terrifies them. And everything is driven by that. That's why they support somebody like Donald Trump, who's a blatant racist. And his number one policy advisor is Stephen Miller, who may be even worse than him. So, and what the Democrats have been doing, especially with this proposal, is they have been so fearful about the attacks from the right and how it's such a hot button political issue that now, and I hate to say this, the Democrats are actually using it as a political issue now because it's put the Republicans in a corner by not supporting it. So for years, it's been a political football, and it still is. And, until we get Democrats in the presidency and the Congress and in the Senate and run the government, none of this is going to change. I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but that's the case.
Sandy?
Well, who's supporting Trump? I know we can whisper about anything, but I've stumbled on Alexander Hinton. Maybe some of you have heard his name, who evidently has written thesis for and evidently read it. I've just read an article on it. One of the things he said was to separate the UK from the European community, which has been done by Boris. And the other thing, which has been rumored for many, many centuries, probably destroy America from within. We've got Eric who says, and I don't see the press bringing this forward, we get all the money we want from Russia. We don't need American money. Ages ago, this was said. Where is that being repeated? And so, this man suggests that it's supposedly Putin is following this guy's, and it's working. And so where is that in the press? Where is the media bringing that forward?
Where's the media period?
By the way, one quick thing. Didn't Trump say the other day, why aren't we letting more people from Scandinavian countries?
Completely about the white racism. And I mean, frankly, that's why Torah's family and my family and a lot of Jewish people that were trying to come here when we really needed to come here couldn't get in because people were scared. Chris?
I just want to suggest something for people who want to get more involved in this issue. I was hoping you mentioned it. One of the largest groups that does work on the border is UUJAZ, which stands for Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona. And we work on all social justice issues, including the border. So half of this room is part of it, and we educate ourselves on all social justice issues, and then we do something about it.
So anybody who's interested, we meet Sunday mornings at 10 at the Zimmer Hub.
So just following up on that, relative to the border, at the synagogue, Unitarian Fellowship is having a panel of speakers from the local community. The topic will be building community, hearing the voices of our Hispanic neighbors. And there'll be both parents and youth talking about their experiences into the Verde Valley from various countries. And this will be July the 7th. The program starts at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Jewish Center in South area, just off once a minute.
Will there be Zoom?
Uh,
I don't think
so.
No. Could be.
We're working on it, but yeah.
You can bring the,
Let me just hold up. This is John's book. The Case for Open Borders, John Washington. A couple of quick announcements. First of all, if you can see the camaraderie that's going on right now, the interest we have in each other. I'm going to make a plug. It's unabashedly plugged. Thanks for being honest. Democrats of the Red Rocks is having a dance. It's a fundraiser on May the 4th. I know a lot of you don't dance. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be at the Fells Club. There's the bar where you won't be able to hear the music too much. There is a beautiful outdoor patio. Part of the reason we want to have an event like this is not just so people can dance, although personally I will be on the dance floor, but it is so we can talk to each other and get to know each other and share ideas and become more unified as a like-minded thinking community. And I'm including a lot of, our independent friends as well. They are totally welcome to this. So on the DORR website is a thing that you can click to RSVP. Please come to the dance just to be around and hang around and schmooze with your friends and talk about issues that are of concern to you. DORR also has a film club, and I wanted to mention that the next meeting of the film club, which has traditionally always been on Zoom, is going to be at Vino di Sedona, so people can talk to each other in person on, let me see the date, it is right here. It is April the 26th. It's a Friday night at 4:30 in the afternoon on at Vino di Sedona. The award-winning film Zone of Interest will be discussed. So just something like that. I mean, it's so important that we all get to know one another and each other and help each other, and we're there for each other when we need it, like campaigning. Volunteering at the DORR office, volunteering through indivisible groups, volunteering wherever we can. We just have so much at stake. So much at stake. It's really hard to sit by and watch. So thank you all for coming. This has been terrific. It's 11 o'clock. Yes.
Just want to give a plug for your group. I'm visiting here from St. Paul, Minnesota. Sally and I grew up together in rural Iowa. And this is just a wonderful meeting, a wonderful speaker, and taking back notes for our Democrats and for our voters and so forth. And oh yeah, lots to do.
That's great. Thank you to our new guests for coming. We appreciate it. We're always looking for new members. By the way, another thing we're planning, May 31st, we are having an outreach event for younger voters. Younger meaning, so please don't laugh. Because our colleague was defining younger was 50 and bring more younger people to our organization. And if we get 10 people who are 48 that sign up to help and work, then that's great. And if we get 21 years old, we're telling them, 25-year-old, bring your kids, 3 people here. And
Well, you'd like to help me
and younger.
stay after the meetings. You're getting it organized.
Sandy?
Someone who's not been involved for a long time, you must be one of the most active groups in the country, so.
Next month, again, Corporation Commission candidates.